The official narrative wants you to believe one story, but the ground truth in Donetsk tells something entirely different. Right now, as Western media celebrates Ukrainian victories and Russian defeats, there's a dangerous disconnect between what we're being told and what's actually unfolding on the battlefield. This isn't just about military tactics or territorial gains. This is about understanding how information warfare shapes our perception of reality itself. In Donetsk, something catastrophic is happening, but the question isn't just what's burning, it's why we're only getting one side of this story. When headlines scream annihilation and total victory, experienced analysts know to dig deeper. Because in modern warfare, especially in this conflict, the first casualty is always truth. What's really happening in eastern Ukraine right now will reshape global power structures for decades to come, and most Americans are being fed a carefully curated version designed to manufacture consent for policies that don't serve their interests. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the consequences of misunderstanding this moment will be felt far beyond the battlefields of Ukraine. Let me be absolutely direct with you about what's unfolding in Donetsk right now, because the gap between media narratives and battlefield realities has become so vast that we're essentially living in two different worlds. When you see headlines proclaiming that Ukraine is annihilating Russian assaults, when you read breathless reports about everything burning and Russian forces in complete disarray, you have to pause and ask yourself a fundamental question. Does this align with what we're actually seeing on the ground, or is this yet another chapter in the most sophisticated information operation of our time? I've spent decades analyzing geopolitical conflicts, studying how narratives are constructed, and watching how public opinion is manufactured to support predetermined policy objectives. What's happening in Donetsk right now is a perfect case study in how modern warfare operates on two distinct planes simultaneously. There's the physical battlefield where real people are dying, real artillery is firing, and real territory is being contested. Then there's the information battlefield where perception is weaponized, narratives are crafted with surgical precision, and the truth becomes whatever serves the strategic interests of those controlling the megaphone. The situation in Donetsk has been evolving for months now, and if you've been following alternative sources and actually mapping the territorial changes, you'll notice something that contradicts the triumphalist headlines coming out of Western media. The Russian forces have been methodically advancing, not in the dramatic sweeping movements that make for good television, but in the grinding, systematic way that characterized Eastern Front warfare historically. They're using a strategy that prioritizes the preservation of their own forces while inflicting maximum attrition on Ukrainian units. This is not the army that was supposed to run out of ammunition 6 months ago. This is not the military that was supposed to collapse under the weight of Western sanctions. This is a force that has adapted, learned, and restructured itself based on the realities of 21st century warfare. When we talk about everything burning in Donetsk, we need to understand what that actually means. Yes, there is massive destruction. Yes, urban areas are being reduced to rubble. But who's doing the destroying and why? The Ukrainian forces have been using a defensive strategy that involves turning urban areas into fortified positions, which inevitably means that when Russian forces advance, the ensuing battles result in catastrophic destruction. This is not a sign of Ukrainian strength or Russian weakness. This is the predictable outcome of a military strategy that uses civilian infrastructure as defensive positions, knowing full well that Western media will frame the resulting destruction as evidence of Russian brutality rather than as the consequence of Ukraine's own tactical choices. The narrative that Ukraine is annihilating Russian assaults requires us to ignore some pretty obvious facts. If Ukrainian forces were truly decimating Russian attacks, we would expect to see territorial gains by Ukraine, not continued Russian advances. We would expect to see dramatic reductions in Russian combat capability, not the steady grinding progress we're actually witnessing. We would expect to see Ukrainian forces launching successful counteroffensives, not desperately trying to hold defensive lines that keep getting pushed back despite massive Western military aid. The disconnect between the narrative and the observable reality is staggering, and it raises serious questions about why this particular story is being pushed so aggressively. Think about the broader context for a moment. The United States and its NATO allies have poured tens of billions of dollars into Ukraine. They've provided advanced weapons systems, intelligence support, training, and logistical backing on a scale that dwarfs anything we've seen in recent conflicts. The political capital invested in Ukrainian victory is enormous. Western leaders have staked their credibility on the proposition that Ukraine can and will prevail. Given these stakes, is it any surprise that the media narrative reflects what these leaders need to be true rather than what actually is true? This is not about conspiracy. This is about understanding how institutional incentives shape information flows. The reality in Donetsk is far more complex and far more troubling than either side's propaganda would have you believe. Russian forces are advancing, but at significant cost and with challenges that suggest this conflict is far from any kind of easy victory for Moscow. Ukrainian forces are fighting with remarkable tenacity, but they're doing so while suffering casualties that are simply unsustainable in the long term. The Western aid that was supposed to turn the tide has certainly extended Ukraine's ability to fight, but it hasn't fundamentally altered the trajectory of the conflict. What we're witnessing is a slow-motion tragedy where the outcome becomes more predictable with each passing month. Yet the commitment to maintaining the narrative prevents the kind of diplomatic engagement that might actually save lives. Let's talk about what annihilation actually looks like in modern warfare, because the word gets thrown around constantly without much consideration for its actual meaning. Annihilation in military terms refers to the complete destruction of an enemy force's ability to continue fighting. It means breaking their command structure, eliminating their logistics, destroying their equipment, and rendering them combat ineffective. When we look at Russian forces in and around Donetsk, we see continued operational capability, sustained artillery fire, ongoing tactical advances, and coordinated combined arms operations. This is not an annihilated force. This is an army that continues to function despite everything that's been thrown at it. The Ukrainian military deserves credit for its resilience and tactical competence in many areas, but resilience and tactical competence don't change the fundamental arithmetic of this conflict. Russia has greater manpower reserves, greater industrial capacity for weapons production, greater resources, and the strategic depth to sustain a prolonged conflict. Ukraine, for all its courage and Western support, is fighting a war of attrition against an adversary that can afford to fight wars of attrition. The mathematics of this situation are brutal and unforgiving, and no amount of optimistic media coverage changes the underlying calculus. What's particularly disturbing about the current information environment is how it precludes serious discussion of diplomatic solutions. If you believe Ukraine is winning decisively, if you believe Russian forces are being annihilated, if you believe that just a bit more military aid will bring total Ukrainian victory, then why would you advocate for negotiations? Why would you push for a diplomatic settlement when complete victory is supposedly just around the corner? This is exactly how narratives become traps that prevent rational policy making. Leaders become prisoners of their own propaganda, unable to pursue realistic solutions because doing so would require admitting that the narrative they've been promoting was always detached from reality. The people of Donetsk, both those in Ukrainian-controlled areas and those in Russian-controlled territories, are living through hell. Their cities are being destroyed, their lives are being shattered, and their futures are being sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical competition between great powers who see them primarily as pawns in a larger game. When we talk about everything burning, we should remember that real people's homes are burning, real families are being torn apart, and real communities are being erased. The tragedy of this conflict isn't just military, it's profoundly human, and the failure to acknowledge this human cost in favor of triumphalist narratives or demonizing propaganda is itself a moral failure. The Western media's coverage of this conflict has been remarkably one-dimensional from the beginning. We were told Russia would run out of ammunition within months. We were told the Russian economy would collapse under sanctions. We were told Russian forces were demoralized and on the verge of mutiny. We were told that Western weapon systems would provide Ukraine with decisive advantages. Each of these predictions has failed to materialize in the way we were promised, yet the same sources continue to make similarly confident predictions without ever accounting for their previous failures. At what point do we start questioning the reliability of these information sources? Understanding what's really happening in Donetsk requires us to consult multiple sources, including Russian military bloggers, independent analysts, satellite imagery, and leaked documents when available. It requires cross-referencing claims against observable evidence and being willing to accept uncomfortable truths that don't fit neat narratives. The picture that emerges from this kind of analysis is messy and ambiguous, which is exactly what we should expect from a complex military conflict. War is rarely clean, victories are rarely total, and the side that's winning today may be losing tomorrow. The certainty with which media narratives are presented should itself be a red flag, suggesting that we're being sold a story rather than being given analysis. The geopolitical implications of what's happening in Donetsk extend far beyond Ukraine's borders. This conflict has accelerated the fracturing of the post-Cold War international order, pushed Russia and China into closer alignment, demonstrated the limits of Western economic warfare, and revealed deep divisions within Western societies about their own interests and values. The outcome in Donetsk, whenever it comes and whatever form it takes, will influence global power dynamics for decades. It will affect how other countries view American security guarantees, how they assess the reliability of Western support, and how they calculate their own strategic interests in a multipolar world. When Russian forces advance in Donetsk, which they have been doing steadily despite the contrary narratives, they're not just taking territory, they're demonstrating that Western military aid, while substantial, has not been sufficient to reverse the fundamental dynamics of this conflict. They're showing that economic sanctions, while painful, have not crippled Russia's ability to wage war. They're proving that international isolation, while real, has not prevented Russia from finding alternative partners and markets. These demonstrations have consequences that ripple outward, affecting how countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America calculate their own relationships with major powers. The question we should be asking is not whether Ukraine is annihilating Russian assaults, because the evidence suggests that's not happening in any meaningful sense. The question we should be asking is why we're being told this story so insistently, and what purposes this narrative serves. Who benefits from Americans believing that Ukraine is winning decisively? Who benefits from the continued flow of military aid and the prolongation of this conflict? Who benefits from the prevention of diplomatic negotiations that might end the killing, but would require acknowledging uncomfortable realities about spheres of influence, great power politics, and the limits of Western power projection? The burning of Donetsk is real, but it's not evidence of what we're being told it represents. It's evidence of the horrific human cost of great power competition, of the failure of diplomacy, of the triumph of narrative over reality in shaping public opinion and policy. Every building that burns represents lives disrupted or destroyed. Every tactical advance or retreat represents human beings killed or wounded. Every day this conflict continues represents another day that diplomatic solutions are postponed in favor of military outcomes that grow less achievable even as they're portrayed as imminent. What's happening in Donetsk should force us to confront some deeply uncomfortable questions about how we receive and process information about conflicts that our governments are involved in. It should make us question the automatic assumption that our media sources are providing us with accurate, objective analysis rather than narratives designed to generate public support for predetermined policies. It should make us wonder whether the billions being spent on military aid might be better spent on diplomatic initiatives that could actually end the killing. And it should make us ask whether we're willing to accept an information environment where questioning official narratives is treated as evidence of disloyalty rather than as the essential function of citizens in a democracy. The trajectory of this conflict has been clear for months to anyone willing to look beyond the triumphalist headlines. Russian forces continue to advance. Ukrainian forces continue to suffer unsustainable casualties despite fighting bravely, and Western support continues to be sufficient to prolong the conflict but not to change its fundamental direction. This is not Russian propaganda. This is observable reality confirmed by territorial maps, casualty figures when honestly reported, and the increasing desperation in requests for ever more advanced weapon systems. When you need constantly escalating military aid just to maintain your position, you're not winning. You're losing slowly. The people making decisions about this conflict, both in Washington and in European capitals, surely have access to better intelligence than what's presented in media coverage. They know the real situation on the ground. They understand the trajectory. So why do they continue to support a strategy that's clearly not achieving its stated objectives? Perhaps because the stated objectives were never the real objectives. Perhaps because the actual goal is not Ukrainian victory, but Russian exhaustion and weakening, regardless of the cost to Ukraine. Perhaps because ending the conflict would require admitting mistakes and reconsidering policies that have become politically untouchable. Or perhaps because the military-industrial complex and the foreign policy establishment have their own interests that don't necessarily align with the interests of ordinary Americans or Ukrainians. Understanding Donetsk means understanding that we're watching a tragedy unfold, where the victims are being used as props in a larger geopolitical drama. It means recognizing that the narrative of annihilation and burning is designed to generate emotional responses that preclude rational analysis. It means accepting that the world is more complex, more ambiguous, and more resistant to simple good versus evil framings than our media and political leaders want us to believe. Most importantly, it means being willing to seek out alternative information sources, to question confident assertions, and to think critically about who benefits from the stories we're being told. The truth in Donetsk, as in most conflicts, is neither what one side claims nor what the other asserts. It's somewhere in the messy, complicated middle, and finding it requires effort, skepticism, and a willingness to accept uncomfortable realities. That's the real challenge facing anyone trying to understand what's actually happening in this conflict, and it's a challenge that most people, unfortunately, are not willing to undertake.